The crowd went quiet, not a whisper, not a shuffle, just silence. Then someone gasped, a soft, startled sound, like a balloon deflating in church. Elvis didn't move. His shoulders stiff. His hand, gripping the microphone like it was his last anchor. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, he lowered it. His eyes dropped to the floor. The spotlight no longer framed a king, it now revealed a man unraveling. And then he turned, just slightly, away from the stage lights. And in full view of thousands, Elvis Presley wiped his eyes. The note had been short, a few lines, written in quiet ink. But it came from someone who knew exactly where his armor cracked. Someone who didn't need to raise her voice to shake his world. It came from Priscilla. And in that moment, as the note was read aloud, the king of rock and roll wasn't singing. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't performing. He was breaking. This is the story of that night. A night that began like any other Elvis concert, lights, screams, music, mythology. And ended with silence, a silence so loud it echoed for decades. But to understand what really happened when that note was read, to understand why Elvis, the man the world saw as untouchable, froze in front of thousands, you have to go back. You have to go before the spotlight, before the velvet curtain, before the heartbreak. Back to a love story that was never fully told, at least not like this. Because what Priscilla wrote that night wasn't just a message. It was a mirror. And Elvis was forced to look. He still said her name like it was fragile. Even after the divorce, even after the headlines, the tabloids, the distance, there was something different in his voice when he spoke about Priscilla. It was softer, like a man remembering the place he once called home. Elvis didn't talk much about emotions in public. He gave jokes, grins, and the occasional wink to the audience, but feelings? No, those were private, locked behind the gates of Graceland and the walls of his own chest. But on stage, sometimes it slipped. Sometimes a lyric would catch in his throat. Sometimes he'd pause before a song just long enough for the crowd to wonder, was that real? The truth is, Elvis Presley was a master of performance, but he wasn't made of stone. And when it came to Priscilla, he never truly let her go. The world saw their breakup as the end of a fairy tale, but behind closed doors there were letters, phone calls, gentle co-parenting of Lisa Marie, and unresolved words, unspoken apologies, unfinished songs, things said too late and things never said at all. So when that note was read aloud from her, it wasn't just ink on paper. It was a wave crashing through years of buried emotion. No one expected it. Not the fans, not the band. And certainly not Elvis. Because in that moment, the king wasn't prepared for a reminder that love, real love, doesn't always end when the papers are signed. Sometimes it lingers. Sometimes it waits. And sometimes it finds a way back in, even in the middle of a concert. What happened on that stage that night wasn't rehearsed, it wasn't scripted, it wasn't even planned. But it revealed something the world had only guessed at. That Elvis Presley, the legend, still carried the weight of one woman's name deep in his heart. And when her words were read aloud, he could no longer carry it alone. Before the tear, before the note, before the crowd saw their king crumble into a man, there was a different kind of silence. The kind that lives between two people who once shared everything and now only share memories. To understand that moment on stage, that long pause where Elvis turned away from the spotlight and into himself, you have to understand the road that brought him there. Because love like theirs doesn't just vanish. It echoes. He met her in a foreign country. Germany, 1959. Elvis was stationed with the U.S. Army. Priscilla was just 14 years old, quiet, elegant, and poised beyond her years. And yet, something about her disarmed him. Not with glamour, not with games, but with innocence. She wasn't dazzled by his fame. She didn't try to impress him. She just listened. And in Elvis's world, a world of screaming fans, media storms, and gold lame suits, that kind of silence was rare. He wrote her letters, dozens, even after he returned to the States. And over the next few years, he didn't just fall for her. He made room for her in his carefully guarded kingdom. By 1963, she was living at Graceland, under strict rules, yes, but with growing emotional closeness. By 1967, they were married. By 1968, they had Lisa Marie. To the outside world, it looked perfect. America's king had found his queen. But fairy tales, especially ones written in gold records and stage lights, don't always hold up under pressure. Graceland was never just a home. It was a sanctuary and a prison. The walls were thick with handlers, bodyguards, advisors. The schedules were insane, nights blurred into mornings, tour bled into rehearsals. And through it all, Priscilla tried to find her place. But how do you build a marriage with a man the world believes belongs to them? How do you argue with someone who's been told, yes, since the age of 19? Elvis was loving, but he was also restless. He craved intensity. He lived for the highs. But domestic life, quiet dinners, diaper changes, small talk, that wasn't where he thrived. The cracks weren't dramatic, they were slow. Like a love note left unread. Like silence after a song. They drifted, gently, quietly. But pain doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers and waits. By 1972, Priscilla made the call that would haunt both of them. She left. It wasn't a scandal, it wasn't a fight. It was simply the sound of someone finally choosing themselves. And Elvis wasn't ready for that kind of silence. He never blamed her publicly, never slandered. In fact, he often spoke of her with surprising grace. But in private, he would stare at old photographs. He'd ask friends if she was okay. He'd sit at the piano, playing half-finished melodies no one else had heard. He once told a friend, "I didn't treat her the way she deserved." And sometimes, in the middle of a show, just before launching into "Always on My Mind," or "You Were Always There," his voice would tighten. Just for a second. As if her name, though unspoken, was still sitting just beneath the lyrics. She raised their daughter with devotion. She made careful decisions to protect Elvis's image, even after the divorce. She attended shows occasionally, quietly, from the wings. And while they moved on, she had new relationships, and Elvis pursued others. They always stayed connected. Not romantically, but soulfully. It was complicated, but it was real. She once said, "Elvis and I loved each other deeply. We just couldn't live with each other." And that quote, that ache, that contradiction, it sat beneath everything. Beneath the rhinestones, beneath the gold records, beneath the sunglasses and the swagger and the legend. At his core, Elvis Presley was a man who never quite got over the woman who saw him before the world did. The public never knew just how deep the wounds went. They saw the concerts, the jumpsuits, the iconic poses. But what they didn't see was the man alone in his dressing room. The man scribbling lyrics at 3 a.m. The man calling her name in old demos that were never released. The man whose eyes searched the front row, sometimes hopping and sometimes fearing that she might be there. Elvis didn't need words to say what he felt. His silences said enough. And over the years, those silences began to grow louder. So when that note, that quiet, unexpected note, was handed to someone on stage and read aloud, everything stopped. Because it wasn't just paper. It was memory. It was regret. It was all the things he never said out loud, now spoken for him in her handwriting. And it shattered him. People close to him said he was never quite the same after the divorce. Not emotionally. He still performed, still toured, still joked with fans and gave everything on stage. But backstage, there was a weight, a heaviness, like someone carrying around a song he never got to finish. And that's what makes what happened that night so powerful. Because for a man like Elvis Presley, a man who was larger than life, to be silenced by a few handwritten lines, it tells you everything you need to know about how deep that love really ran. Not all heartbreak is explosive. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it takes years to surface. And sometimes it shows up as a note read aloud under stage lights, where the whole world gets to see what only one woman ever truly understood. So when the crowd watched Elvis lower his mic, when they saw him wipe his eyes, when the music stopped and the legend stood still, it wasn't just a reaction. It was a revelation. A rare, unscripted moment when Elvis Presley, the king, let the mask fall and let the world see the man. And that story, that vulnerability, begins here. With a letter and a love that never really left. It was supposed to be another show. Just another night in Vegas. Another sold-out crowd, another sea of flashbulbs, another hour of sweat, sequins, and signature moves. But something felt off. Not wrong, not broken, just different. It started before he even stepped on stage. Elvis had always been a bundle of nervous energy before a show, packing, humming to himself, brushing his fingers along the edges of his belt as if the rhinestones grounded him. But that night, he didn't speak much. Didn't joke with the boys. Didn't rehearse the transitions. He just sat, quiet, staring down at the floor of the dressing room like he was listening for something no one else could hear. Joe Esposito, his longtime friend and road manager, later said, he looked like he was waiting for a phone call that never came. Nobody knew why. The crowd outside didn't sense it. They were buzzing, electric, alive. A theater packed with expectation, Elvis fans old and new, all waiting for the first flash of white jumpsuit to step into the light. And when he finally did, it was met with the usual eruption. Cheers, screams, hands reaching toward the stage like they were reaching for something sacred. Elvis smiled, he always did. But if you looked close, something behind the smile was slower. Thinner, like it cost more than it used to. He launched into the first few songs effortlessly. CC Rider, I Got a Woman, You Don't Have to Say You Love Me. His voice was strong, his timing sharp. But his eyes, they drifted. He wasn't locked in, not like usual. The band noticed it. Ronnie Tutt on drums said later, he was singing the songs, but he wasn't in the songs. He missed a lyric during Love Me. Skipped a cue during Fever. Small things, the kind only his band would catch, but things that hinted something was stirring beneath the surface. And then the shift happened. It was midway through the show, just before he was set to sing You Gave Me a Mountain. A stagehand approached from the wing, cautiously, almost apologetically, and handed Charlie Hodge a small envelope. Charlie, always close to Elvis, glanced at it and paused. It wasn't fan mail. It wasn't lyrics. It was something else. He leaned in and whispered something in Elvis's ear. Elvis turned toward him, his smile faded. He took the envelope with both hands, just held it, didn't open it. Just held it. The crowd didn't know anything had happened. The music continued. But those close to the stage saw it, the change in posture, the weight in his shoulders. Inside that envelope was a note. A personal note. From Priscilla. Now here's the thing. She hadn't been in the audience that night. She wasn't backstage. She hadn't made an appearance. But the note had been sent through someone close to the Presley family, a quiet gesture, timed without spectacle. It wasn't meant to be read aloud, it wasn't meant for the audience. But fate doesn't follow scripts. And Elvis couldn't ignore what was in his hand. He moved toward the microphone again, but this time, he didn't start the next song. He looked down. Then he looked back up to Charlie. Charlie gave him a questioning nod, as if to say, "You sure?" Elvis didn't answer with words. He simply opened the envelope and pulled out the note. The band held. The audience began to murmur just lightly as he stood there, reading silently. A long pause. Then another. And then he folded the note and handed it back to Charlie. He didn't say a word. Didn't cue the band. Didn't speak to the crowd. Just stood. In stillness. It was the kind of pause that made everyone in the theater feel like they were eavesdropping on something private. A moment not meant to be seen. But they were seeing it. A man unraveling in real time. The lights felt too bright. The stage too open. The silence too loud. And still, Elvis said nothing. Then came a whisper from somewhere behind the curtain, likely one of the crew asking if everything was all right. He blinked, looked out into the audience, and finally, quietly walked back to the mic. No words. Just a breath. And then he whispered something to the band. They nodded. And instead of singing, "You Gave Me a Mountain," he launched unexpectedly into "It's Over." A song about finality, about loss, about learning to live with the silence someone leaves behind. And when he sang the line, "If time were not a moving thing, and I could make it stay," his voice cracked. Not in volume. In honesty. And that's when the audience began to understand. Whispers spread through the crowd. Some knew, some didn't. But every soul in that theater could feel something had changed. Elvis wasn't performing anymore. He was bleeding. And no one knew why, not yet. They didn't know what the note said. Didn't know who had sent it. Didn't know why it had left him so hollow. But they knew it mattered. And they couldn't look away. After the song ended, he turned his back to the audience for a moment. He held the mic behind him like a weight. Took one long breath. And when he turned back around, he whispered into it. "Some things still get to me." That's all he said. Then he smiled, a small, tired smile, and went on with the show. But it wasn't the same anymore. From that moment on, the tension didn't ease. It hung over the rest of the performance like fog. He got through the songs. He even joked once or twice. But something had been pierced. Something real. Raw. Unrehearsed. And for the first time in a long time, Elvis Presley wasn't the king. He was just a man standing on a stage, trying not to fall apart. That was the night everything changed. Not publicly. There were no headlines the next day. No interviews, no scandals. But the people in that room, they never forgot it. Because when you see someone like Elvis, a man built of myth, brought to silence by a single piece of paper, you don't forget it. You can't. The air inside the theater had shifted. Even the crowd could feel it now, like the temperature had dropped a few degrees. Something was different. Not just the packing of the show. Not just the way Elvis moved slower, spoke less, avoided eye contact. There was an invisible weight hanging over the stage, a pressure, a presence. And then it happened. The note. The one he had held in his hands earlier, folded, personal, not meant for the spotlight, somehow found its way back into the moment. No one knew who made the calls. Some say it was Charlie trying to break the tension. Some say Elvis gave a subtle nod. Some say it just happened. But whatever the truth, the spotlight hit center stage. And Charlie Hodge stepped forward. In his hands, that envelope. His voice came through the mic, soft and respectful. This was given to us earlier tonight. The audience hushed instantly. A few leaned in. A few shifted in their seats. And then he read it. It wasn't long. Just a few lines. But it was enough to pull the curtain back, not on the stage, but on the heart of the man standing in front of them. To Elvis, I hope tonight brings you peace. You once told me that music was where you found your truth. I hope it still is. You're still in my prayers, and Lisa sends her love. Zillow. That was it. No poetry. No drama. Just a gentle message from someone who still knew him better than most. But to Elvis, it was everything. He froze. Not dramatically. Just stopped. One foot slightly forward, one hand still gripping the mic stand, the other limp at his side. And then, slowly, he turned his head to the side. Not to look at anyone, but to not be seen. The band didn't move. The audience didn't breathe. The lights didn't flicker. It was as if time had been suspended. In that stillness, something shattered. A single tear rolled down his cheek. Not wiped away. Not hidden. Just allowed to fall. And that was when the crowd began to understand. This wasn't just a message. It was her message. From Priscilla. The woman he had loved. The woman he had lost. And perhaps the only woman who could still break him with a whisper. For nearly a full minute, Elvis said nothing. 60 seconds of silence might not sound like much. But on a Vegas stage, in the middle of a packed show, it's an eternity. He didn't fidget. Didn't wipe his face. Didn't gesture to the band. He just stood there, suspended between the man he was and the man he used to be. A woman in the third row gasped. A man in the balcony murmured, "Oh my God." Someone else whispered that was from her. But no one dared speak louder than that. Because even they knew. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was real. This was something sacred. And then Elvis lifted his head. Just slightly. And turned toward the crowd. His eyes weren't red, but they were wet, alive, unmasked. He brought the mic to his lips. And in a low, shaking voice, he said, "She always knew how to hit the right note. No joke. No wink. No comeback. Just that. A confession in disguise. A man standing in front of thousands, admitting that no matter how many stages he'd conquered, one letter from her could still undo him." And then, as if remembering the show, remembering the people, remembering himself, he nodded to the band. A faint nod, measured, grateful. They knew what to do. Without another word, he began to sing. Not a flashy number. Not a crowd favorite. But a ballad. "You were always on my mind." His voice trembled at first. Then steadied. Then soared. It wasn't perfect. But it was raw. Alive. The kind of performance that tears a piece out of the room and gives it back as something permanent. And as he sang the final line, "Maybe I didn't treat you quite as good as I should have," the crowd could barely hold their applause. Not because it was over, but because they didn't want to break the spell. When the last note faded, he stood still once more. Then, with a quiet breath, he said, "Thank you for letting me sing that one," and walked off stage. Not with drama, not with bows, just a quiet, gentle exit. A man who had shown too much. A man who had let the world in just for a moment and now needed space to breathe. Backstage, no one said a word. Not the crew, not the band, not even Elvis himself. He walked past the dressing room, found a stool in the hallway and sat. Still in costume. Still glowing with sweat. Still holding everything he couldn't say in that note. Joe sat beside him. Didn't ask questions, didn't offer advice. Just sat with him in the quiet. And after several minutes, Elvis looked up and said, "She didn't have to say much, did she?" That night there were no headlines. No interviews, no quotes. But the people who were there never forgot it. Some say it was the most human moment they'd ever seen on a stage. Some say it was the most painful. But everyone agrees. That note, it broke something open. Not just in Elvis, but in everyone watching. Because in a world built on fame, noise, and spectacle, what truly shattered the crowd was silence, a tear, a name, and the power of a few quiet words from someone who once held the heart of a legend. When the show ended that night, there was no encore, no final bow, no drawn-out farewell. No thank you, you've been a beautiful audience. Just a slow walk off stage and silence. The theater stayed still for a moment, as if no one quite knew what to do. It wasn't disappointment. It wasn't confusion. It was reverence. As if the audience knew they had witnessed something too personal for applause. Like they'd seen someone cry behind a one-way mirror and weren't sure whether to look away or hold on tighter. Backstage, Elvis didn't change right away. He kept the jumpsuit on longer than usual, sat in a chair in the corner, towel in hand, barely speaking. The note, her note, rested on the vanity table beside him. Still folded. Still radiating something too delicate to name. One of the crew asked if he was all right. Elvis looked up and gave a faint smile, not performance, not sarcasm. Just a weary, honest, yeah. But everyone around him knew he was. Not in a dangerous way. Not in a broken way. But in a moved way. Like someone who had been handed a memory too sharp to put down. That night, Elvis didn't go out. Didn't party, didn't take guests, didn't even go to his usual hotel suite. He asked the driver to take him for a ride. No destination. No plan. Just the road and the city lights. Joe Esposito rode with him. Neither of them said much. And after a long stretch of silence, Elvis spoke. "You know, Joe, people think the hardest part of life is losing someone. But it's not. It's knowing they're still out there, breathing the same air, and you can't go back." The next day, the tabloids didn't mention the note. There were no photos, no gossip. Only vague headlines about an emotional moment during the show. Because that's the thing about truth, the real kind of truth. It doesn't make for easy headlines. It can't be captured in flashbulbs or summarized in 5 sentences. It just lingers in the people who were there and in the man who lived it. The band knew not to bring it up. They rehearsed the next day like normal. But when Elvis walked in, there was something softer in the room. No sunglasses. No entourage. Just Elvis, quieter than usual. He walked to the piano, sat down, and started playing without a word. Not one of his hits. Not even something well-known. Just a soft, aching melody that drifted through the room like a sigh. And when he finished, he whispered. That one was for her. In the days that followed, Elvis didn't talk about the letter publicly. But he did keep it. He folded it neatly, placed it inside a small velvet pouch, and tucked it into the drawer of his dressing room. right next to his Bible. He didn't read it often, but sometimes, especially on quiet nights before a show, he'd take it out, hold it for a moment, and breathe a little slower. Priscilla never made a statement about the note. But a few years later, in an interview, she was asked if she and Elvis had kept in touch after the divorce. She smiled gently, wistfully, and said, "There were things we never stopped sharing. Some don't need to be spoken to be understood." The interviewer moved on. But those who knew, they knew. That moment on stage wasn't just a blip in a concert. It was a mirror held up to a man who had spent years building walls around his fame, around his pain, around his past. And for one unexpected, unscripted moment, those walls cracked. The audience didn't cheer because they felt it. They knew they had witnessed something real, something rare. And in a world obsessed with perfection and performance, that kind of truth is unforgettable. For many fans, that night became legendary. Not because of a song, not because of a stunt, but because the man behind the music finally stepped forward and stopped pretending. Letters poured in the following week. Some from fans thanking Elvis for being vulnerable. Some from others who had lost love and found healing in his silence. But one letter stood out. It came from a woman in her 60s who had traveled from across the country just to see him perform live. Her note read, "I didn't come for the music. I came because your songs held my grief when I couldn't hold it myself. But last night, for the first time, I saw you grieving too. And I've never felt more seen in my life." Elvis had that letter framed. It hung in his personal office at Graceland, right above the fireplace. They say the strongest legacies aren't built on gold records or sold-out tour. They're built on the moments when someone stops being larger than life and becomes just life. Messy, honest, cracked open. And that night, with one tear and a letter from a woman who knew his soul, Elvis Presley did just that. He didn't shatter in front of his fans. He became real. And that, more than any hit song, is what people remember. Because it's one thing to wear a crown on stage. It's another to take it off and show the world what's underneath. And that's what Priscilla's note did. Not by force, not by guilt, but by love, by memory, by timing, by a line that said, "Lisa sends her love." That's what broke him. Not heartbreak, not regret, but connection. A reminder that even after everything, the thread hadn't snapped. It had simply stretched across time, quietly, invisibly, still tied at both ends. So when Elvis walked off that stage, with wet eyes and trembling hands, he wasn't just leaving a concert. He was walking out of a moment that none of them could ever recreate. And maybe he didn't want to. Because for a man who had lived through applause, fame, and fortune, it was the quietest moment that left the deepest echo. When you think of Elvis Presley, 100 images come to mind. The white jumpsuit, the curled lip, the roar of a crowd, the flash of Vega's lights, the sunglasses, the swagger, the shaking hips. But for the people who were there that night, that's not what they remember. They don't talk about what he wore. They don't list the songs he sang. They don't quote a single lyric. They remember the silence, the pause, the way he lowered his head when Priscilla's words echoed through the mic. They remember how it felt when their idol, the one they had watched from afar, admired from a distance, suddenly looked like someone they knew. Someone they were. Someone human. And isn't that strange? That out of all the glitter, the glory, the headlines, it's one quiet moment, unscripted, unfiltered, that still lingers decades later. Because that's the thing about legacy. It isn't just built on the things you do loudest. It's shaped by the things you do when no one expects you to fall silent. Elvis was known for many things. His voice, his style, his impact on music and culture. But that night, when a folded piece of paper cracked open something raw inside him, he gave the world a different kind of gift. Permission. Permission to feel. Permission to grieve. Permission to be both legend and man in the same breath. And for fans who had spent years idolizing the myth, that moment did something extraordinary. It made the myth real. To this day, fans talk about it not like a performance, but like a shared memory. People who were there describe it like it was holy. You could hear hearts breaking in that room. I didn't know what was happening, but I felt like I was watching someone say goodbye to something they never stopped loving. I went in expecting a show. I left with a story I've told my grandchildren. It was Elvis, the entertainer they saw that night. It was Elvis, the echo of past love, of unspoken truths, of everything that fame can't protect you from. And in that moment, Elvis reminded us that legacy isn't just what you leave behind. It's what you carry even when it hurts. He carried Priscilla's memory. He carried Lisa's smile. He carried the weight of a love he couldn't rewrite. And he didn't run from it, didn't disguise it, didn't perform through it. He stood in it. Let it wash over him. Let thousands watch as the note landed, not on stage, but on his heart. That's why this story lives on. Not because of the note itself, not even because of what it said, but because of what it revealed. That even after all the lights, the noise, the legend, Elvis still felt. And those feelings, they mattered more than any encore. After that night, something shifted in the way fans viewed him. There was always respect, always love, but now there was understanding, a kind of gentle reverence, not for his stagecraft, but for his silence, not for his control, but for his surrender. Because when you see someone you thought was invincible break for just a second, you don't lose respect. You gain connection. Years later, when Elvis passed away in 1977, stories poured in from all over the world. People lit candles, cried in the streets, lined up for hours outside Graceland. But if you spoke to some of the fans who had seen that show, the night the note was read, they mourned differently. They didn't grieve the superstar. They grieved the man they had seen stripped bare by a message no one else could have written. And perhaps that's the deepest mark of Priscilla's presence in his life. She didn't just love him in the spotlight. She knew him in the quiet. And her words, brief, unflashy, heartfelt, reminded everyone that Elvis wasn't just a voice, or a face, or a figure frozen in time. He was real. He was vulnerable. He was haunted by love. And now, all these years later, we still talk about it. We still feel it. Because in that moment, he became more than a legend. He became a mirror. A mirror for anyone who's ever read a letter they weren't ready for. For anyone who's ever loved someone they couldn't hold on to. For anyone who's ever had to sing through the pain because silence would break them even more. Elvis Presley sang thousands of songs. But that night, he spoke a different language. One of silence, of breath, of unspoken history. And in doing so, he gave us a moment that still echoes not in our ears, but in our chests. Because legacies like his, they don't fade. They shift. From the billboard to the soul. From the radio to the bloodstream. From a voice we remember to a feeling we never forget. So the next time someone asks you, what made Elvis so special? Don't start with the records. Don't start with the movies. Don't start with the fame. Tell them about the letter. The night the crowd went quiet. The night he lowered his mic. The night a tear rolled down his cheek and landed not on the stage, but on history. It's been decades now. The stage has long gone dark. The mic stand is still. The crowd that once held its breath has scattered across time. And yet that moment, that one silent moment, hasn't faded. It lingers, not in the charts, not in the tabloids, but in the hearts of those who saw it, those who felt it, those who will never forget the night the king of rock and roll put down his crown for a single heartbeat and simply let himself feel. He didn't say much, just a line or two, but it was enough. Because when you spend your life performing, even a single moment of truth feels seismic. And on that stage, under those lights, Elvis Presley gave us a truth that no song could carry. He showed us that even the biggest legends have soft spots. Even the loudest voices carry silence. And even the most powerful men are still tethered to love. That's the part people don't talk about enough. The quiet legacy. The stuff that doesn't make headlines or platinum records. The moments that happen between the notes. Between the fame. Between the chaos. The way he folded that note after the show and tucked it gently into his coat pocket. The way he said nothing when he could have turned it into a spectacle. The way he sang, "You Were Always on My Mind," like it was the first time, like it still hurt. That's not performance. That's not theater. That's memory. And memory, when handled with care, becomes something sacred. There's a photograph taken days after that show. Elvis is seated at a piano, alone, bathed in a soft amber light. He's not looking at the keys, not playing. Just staring, lost in thought. You wouldn't know it by looking, but in the drawer behind him, quietly resting under his sunglasses and cufflinks, sits a small, folded letter. Same paper, same handwriting. The only artifact from that night he chose to keep. Not the set list. Not the costume. Not the photos. The letter. Because deep down, even legends want something real to hold on to. And maybe that's what makes this story so enduring. Not because it shows Elvis as flawless, but because it shows him as fractured. And yet still standing. He didn't fall apart that night. He didn't crumble. He absorbed it. He lived it. And he gave us a gift we didn't expect, a glimpse behind the myth, even if just for a moment. A man, not a monument. Sometimes the most powerful part of a performance is what's left unsaid. And that night, Elvis said very little. But the silence said everything. It said, "I still feel. I still remember. I still love." Not with words, not with noise, but with presence, with stillness, with the kind of vulnerability that only someone who's lost something precious can carry. And that's why, when we talk about Elvis today, we don't just talk about how he sang. We talk about why he sang. We talk about the ache behind the melody. We talk about the pause between verses. We talk about the stories he never told outright, but wove into his music like confessions between the chords. And on that night, the confessions stepped out of the music and into the open. If you've ever loved someone and lost them, if you've ever opened a drawer and found a letter that made your heart stop, if you've ever carried a name longer than you should, then you already understand what happened that night. Because this story isn't just Elvis's. It's ours. You don't need a spotlight to feel heartbreak. You don't need a stage to remember someone's voice. You don't need to be a legend to be undone by a single sentence written in familiar ink. All you need is a moment. One quiet, piercing, unexpected moment. Like the sound of your name being whispered in a crowd. Like a memory knocking at the door of your performance. Like a folded piece of paper held together by everything you never got to say. So if you take anything from this story, let it be this. Legends are made by what they endure, but they're remembered for what they reveal. And in that moment, the night the note was read, Elvis Presley revealed everything. Not by shouting, not by singing, not even by speaking, but by standing still and letting the truth find him. If this story moved you, if it reached something in you you didn't expect, then maybe that's the real legacy. Not just the music, not just the movies, but the mirrors Elvis left behind in each of us. Reflections of pain, of memory, of moments we keep locked inside until someone else dares to show theirs first. There are many stories about Elvis Presley, but this is the story of when the stage didn't matter, when the king became just a man holding a letter, and when a room full of strangers witnessed something they'd never forget. Thank you for watching. If you want more stories like this, raw, real, and written between the spotlights, we invite you to join us. Subscribe, because this is just one of many untold echoes in the life of Elvis Presley. And next time, we'll tell you about the night he held a crying fan in his arms and whispered something that stunned the entire front row. But that's another story. For now, we'll leave you with this. A tear, a silence, and a letter that never needed to be long to last forever.